Imagine living 30 years of your life with a heart filled with hatred, convinced that an entire group of people was your enemy. Now imagine that same group, someone you've been taught to fear, saving your life in a moment of desperation. That's exactly what happened to me. It was in that life or death moment that I discovered something far more powerful than fear. I discovered humanity. Today, I'm here to share how one selfless act shattered a lifetime of ignorance and hatred and how it transformed me into someone who now seeks love, understanding, and unity. Hatred often begins as something we inherit rather than something we choose. For many, it's not an active decision to despise another group, but more of a passive transmission of ideas passed down through family, community, or even society. In the case of the speaker, the hatred towards Muslims was not something they actively cultivated. It was something they absorbed over years, much like a sponge soaking up the water around it. From an early age, the speaker's environment fostered fear and distrust of Muslims. Perhaps it was through negative portrayals in the media, where the few extreme cases were sensationalized, leaving a warped image in the public's mind. The world saw Muslims in a singular, narrow light, as terrorists, radicals, or people whose way of life was vastly different and therefore dangerous. These were the ideas that were ingrained, like a song that plays over and over in the background of your mind until it becomes your truth. Family members, teachers, and peers unknowingly reinforced these notions. The speaker's education was not one of direct hostility, but subtle exclusion. There was no attempt to understand the rich cultural, spiritual, and intellectual contributions of Muslims. Instead, there was a passive acceptance of stereotypes, a comfort in simplicity. All Muslims were the same. This kind of environment breeds a powerful sense of us versus them. It's easy to hate something or someone when you don't know anything about them. When you've been told all your life that they're the enemy, this is the foundation of hate, not an inherent evil, but an environment that nurtures it without question, without room for curiosity, understanding, or empathy. Ignorance in its purest form is not born of malice, but of a lack of exposure and understanding. It is a product of being shielded from the truth, often due to an environment that offers little room for critical thinking or the challenging of deeply ingrained beliefs. For the speaker, their ignorance about Muslims was not a conscious choice. It was a byproduct of the society they lived in and the media narratives they consumed. In many cases, entire communities are unknowingly shaped by an external narrative, one that simplifies complex issues into binary opposites, turning groups of people into caricatures. For the speaker, the narrative surrounding Muslims was one-dimensional, a portrayal shaped by fear and conflict, rooted mostly in sensational headlines rather than nuanced understanding. The images in the media of violence, extremism, and intolerance became the symbols of an entire religion, leading to the assumption that all Muslims must share these traits. This portrayal reinforced the stereotypes and cultivated a deeply entrenched perception of Muslims as the other, as enemies who could not be trusted. This kind of indoctrination isn't just about what is said directly. It's also about what is unsaid. The speaker never learned about the cultural, intellectual, or spiritual beauty of Islam. They weren't encouraged to engage in dialogue, to ask questions, or to seek out alternative perspectives. Instead, they were kept in a bubble, surrounded by the comfort of their own beliefs. And in danger, when ignorance goes unchallenged, it transforms into a rigid belief system, making it nearly impossible to see beyond the narrow confines of one's own understanding. It's in this cocoon of indoctrination that hatred can fester, not as an active emotion, but as an unconscious default, something ingrained over time. A turning point in life often comes when we least expect it. For the speaker, the moment of change arrived in the most unexpected and urgent of circumstances when they found themselves in grave danger, a situation that forced them to confront everything they thought they knew about the world and the people in it. This was not a moment they could have predicted, nor one they could have prepared for. It was a sudden, life-threatening event that would change the course of their life forever. When ignorance goes unchallenged, it transforms into a rigid belief system, making it nearly impossible to see beyond the narrow confines of one's own understanding. It's in this cocoon of indoctrination that hatred can fester, not as an active emotion, but as an unconscious default, something ingrained over time. A turning point in life often comes when we least expect it. For the speaker, the moment of change arrived in the most unexpected and urgent of circumstances when they found themselves in grave danger, a situation that forced them to confront everything they thought they knew about the world and the people in it. This was not a moment they could have predicted, nor one they could have prepared for. It was a sudden, life-threatening event that would change the course of their life forever. Perhaps it was a near-fatal car accident, a violent encounter, or a health crisis that left the speaker vulnerable and alone. In that moment, when time seemed to slow and everything became unclear, the speaker's life hung in the balance. What they could not have known at the time was that the person who would step in to save them, the person who would risk their own safety to ensure the speaker's survival, was someone they had been taught to fear. Someone who wore a different skin, spoke a different language, and followed a different faith. It was a Muslim who arrived as the unexpected hero. In that instant, when there was no time for prejudice, labels, or judgment, all that mattered was the selfless act of saving a life. This person didn't hesitate. There was no thought about race, religion, or background. There was simply the instinct to help, to save, to protect another human being from harm. This moment was a gut punch of reality for the speaker, a harsh reminder that everything they had believed about Muslims, everything they had been taught to fear, was suddenly irrelevant. What mattered now was the undeniable truth that a Muslim had just saved their life. And in that act, all the barriers built by years of ignorance and hatred began to crumble in life. There are moments when a single act of kindness, a single gesture, changes everything. For the speaker, that moment arrived when they were at their lowest, facing a life-threatening situation, and the person who came to their aid was someone they had been taught to fear. The person who saved their life was a Muslim. This individual didn't ask questions about the speaker's past, beliefs, or background. There was no hesitation or judgment in their actions. They acted purely out of a sense of humanity, driven by an instinct to help, to save, to do what was right in that moment. The speaker had no idea who this person was before the incident. They didn't know where they came from, what they believed, or what their life had been like. All that mattered was that this stranger, a Muslim, had put themselves at risk to ensure the speaker's survival. In that act of saving a life, the speaker was forced to confront everything they had been taught to believe. The person who came to their aid wasn't a faceless enemy, as they had been led to think. They weren't the stereotype that had been ingrained in their mind for years. Instead, they were a human being, just like the speaker, capable of compassion, courage, and selflessness. The realization was not just about the individual who had saved them. It was about the entire framework of hatred and ignorance that had governed their thoughts for so long. They began to understand that their views had been built on a foundation of lies and assumptions. They had never taken the time to question the narratives that had been passed down to them. They had never considered that Muslims, like people of any background, were individuals, each with their own stories, values, and humanity. This wasn't just a physical rescue, it was an emotional and moral awakening. The act of saving someone's life transcended all the labels that had once divided them. It shattered the walls of ignorance and prejudice that had been built over decades. The speaker could no longer see Muslims through the narrow lens of hatred because they had witnessed firsthand the depth of humanity in one of them. The realization came slowly, like the fog lifting after a storm, but it hit with a force that could not be ignored. The speaker, once entrenched in a lifetime of fear and hatred toward Muslims, now found themselves face to face with an undeniable truth. The very person who had saved their life was the opposite of everything they had been taught to fear. This was a moment of reckoning, one that forced the speaker to re-examine their entire worldview. Up until this point, the speaker had lived with a perception of Muslims that had been shaped by stereotypes, media portrayals, and the opinions of those around them. They had seen Muslims as the other, a group that was foreign, dangerous, and unlike themselves. But in that life or death situation, those preconceived notions were shattered. The person who had risked everything to save them was not an abstract enemy. They were a human being with compassion, courage, and a deep sense of moral duty. The realization was not just about the individual who had saved them, it was about the entire framework of hatred and ignorance that had governed their thoughts for so long. They began to understand that their views had been built on a foundation of lies and assumptions. They had never taken the time to question the narratives that had been passed down to them. They had never considered that Muslims, like people of any background, were individuals, each with their own stories, values, and humanity. This realization was painful, not just because it challenged everything the speaker had believed, but because it revealed the depth of their own prejudice. It was a wake-up call, an awakening to the fact that hatred is often based on ignorance and a lack of understanding. This moment marked the beginning of the speaker's journey to unlearn the biases they had carried for decades. The moment the speaker's life was saved by a Muslim, an overwhelming flood of emotions began to take hold. First and foremost among them was guilt, a deep, gnawing sense of shame. And for years, they had held on to misconceptions, built walls of fear and mistrust around an entire group of people based on nothing but stereotypes. They had been so sure of their beliefs, so certain in their hatred, that it never occurred to them to question it. But now, standing face to face with the person who had risked their life for theirs, that certainty crumbled away. The guilt was not just about the misplaced hatred toward Muslims. It was the realization of the harm that prejudice, however silent or passive, can do, how it blinds you to the truth of who people really are. The speaker felt ashamed not only of the past animosity, but also of the years wasted living in ignorance, unable to see the humanity in others. This guilt was compounded by the humbling understanding that they had been wrong for so long, and worse, they had never even tried to understand a group of people they now realized had so much to offer. As the layers of guilt peeled away, humility took their place. The speaker began to acknowledge the depth of their own ignorance. They recognized how easy it had been to hate, to hold on to outdated, narrow beliefs, and how difficult it was to unlearn that hatred. This humility wasn't just about feeling bad for what had been, but also about recognizing the need to grow, to change, and to open themselves to learning from the very people they had once rejected. The emotional impact was undeniable. The speaker felt small in the face of the truth, small for their own mistakes, but also, in a strange way, grateful for the chance to correct them. When the speaker's life was saved by a Muslim, it forced them to confront a deeper truth that had been clouded by years of prejudice and misinformation. The reality that human beings are far more alike than they are different. Before the incident, the speaker had allowed labels to define people. They had let religion, ethnicity, and appearance become the boundaries through which they judged others. These labels had been their filters, shaping their views and interactions, keeping them separated from the very humanity of those around them. In that moment of vulnerability, when their life was at risk and they were being helped by a Muslim, all those labels disappeared. The person who saved them wasn't a Muslim in the moment. They were simply a person, a human being who chose to act with kindness and selflessness. The speaker could no longer hold on to the idea that Muslims were a monolithic group defined by extremist or negative stereotypes. They realized that this one act of saving their life was an act of pure humanity. The labels that had divided the speaker from others now seemed irrelevant. The courage, the love, the compassion that drove their savior's actions transcended any classification that could be imposed. It wasn't about being Muslim, it was about being human. The speaker came to understand that no religion, culture, or background could ever define someone's capacity for kindness, bravery, or compassion. This realization was powerful. It shattered the division they had once felt so strongly. The labels they had clung to were no longer the truth, the shared human experience. The emotions, the struggles, the desires was the real connection. In that moment, humanity itself became the only label that mattered. The moment the speaker was saved by a Muslim marked the beginning of a profound transformation, not just in their perception of Muslims, but in their entire worldview. What was once a life shaped by ignorance and prejudice was now being reshaped by the harsh reality of their own mistakes. The speaker's old self, the one that had clung to labels, to hatred, to division, began to crumble. In its place, a new sense of awareness and understanding began to emerge. This transformation wasn't immediate or easy. It was painful, as it required the speaker to confront the harsh truth about their own biases. The guilt they felt for years of harboring unfounded hatred was overwhelming. Yet in this discomfort, there was a powerful opportunity for change. The speaker started to see the world differently. They no longer viewed people through the narrow lens of religion, race, or background. Instead, they saw individuals, each with their own story, their own humanity, their own capacity for goodness. The concept of redemption came hand in hand with this transformation. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about changing the future. The speaker could not undo the years spent in ignorance, but they could choose to make a different path moving forward. They realized that by opening their heart and mind, they had the chance to redeem themselves, not in the eyes of others, but in their own. They could live with integrity, knowing they had made the choice to embrace empathy, to challenge their prejudices, and to fight for unity instead of division. This redemption wasn't about seeking forgiveness from the Muslim community or from anyone else. It was about redeeming their own spirit, about becoming the person who had the courage to face their own faults and take responsibility for their growth. It was a moral and spiritual awakening, a shift that would shape the rest of their life. The transformation the speaker underwent after being saved by a Muslim was not a momentary change. It became the foundation for a new mission in their life. Having been confronted with the raw truth of their past biases, they could no longer simply move on, as though nothing had happened. The realization that hatred and prejudice had clouded their vision for so long left them with a powerful sense of responsibility. A responsibility to not only change themselves, but to also help others see beyond their own biases. This newfound mission was one of advocacy, of challenging stereotypes, and of encouraging dialogue. The speaker understood that their story wasn't just their own. It was a reflection of the broader societal issue of prejudice and ignorance that affected so many. Their mission became clear: to be a voice for those who had been wronged, to stand against the fear that fuels division, and to encourage others to question the labels they had placed on others. In their call to action, the speaker encouraged everyone to look inside themselves first and to ask hard questions, to be willing to confront the parts of themselves that might still be rooted in prejudice. Change, they said, starts with each individual taking responsibility for their own growth and committing to living with a heart full of empathy and understanding. The journey from hatred to understanding is never easy, but it is always possible. It begins with confronting our biases, questioning our inherited beliefs, and recognizing the humanity in those we once feared. My story is a testament to the power of transformation, a reminder that one act of kindness, one moment of vulnerability, can shatter years of prejudice and hatred. Let's commit to seeing each other not through labels, but through the shared experience of being human. Thank you for listening, and I wish you all the courage to challenge your own assumptions. Good luck on your journey of change.